This brings us to the last talk of the day, and I'm going to tell you a little story. So I graduated from Swinburne University in around 1991, so that ages me. And at the time, I was a big fan of the person who I'm about to introduce, and so I was very excited when he submitted a talk, and I was like, this is great, I'm going to get to meet him, and I'm going to get to, finally kind of close the circle on those many years ago that I graduated as a young fan, and I thought he would be old and wizened. And I looked at his photo as all the material started coming through, and I'm like, wait a minute, this guy looks younger than me. There's something wrong. So I would go through Google and I would look for pictures, and I couldn't find any pictures where he looked much, much older than me, as he should have. Me being a young fan and him being a old, wise lettering guru that was taking over Melbourne at the time. And I was devastated to learn that he was literally 2 years older than me. So, so the old and wise and venerable Stephen Banham that I would like to introduce to the stage is literally the same age as me. So I hope he's here, because I haven't actually met him yet, but I think he's I hope he's entered the building. Yes? Is he somewhere? He's there! Beautiful. All right. So please give him his Zimmer frame, because he's supposed to be about 75. But it's lovely to meet you.
That would have to be the scariest intro I've ever had in my career. Jesus. Have to get the police on speed dial when I'm up here. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. No, it was very, very nice to hear that. And thank you all for attending for tonight's talk. I hope you'll find it interesting. And yes, I am old enough to have glasses now, so that's what a PhD does to you, doesn't it? All right. As you may have already picked up on, Australia has a very, very, very long human history, with arguably the longest surviving culture on Earth. Respectfully acknowledging this context, this typographic survey will seem ridiculously brief, because it only covers a tiny 40 years from 1983 to 2023. So that's time, and that's the title. When putting together any historical survey, there is always a temptation to just draw a timeline and simply fill it with chronologically ordered content. But that approach would miss the necessary messiness of how these things work. Much of the audience tonight would be aware that typographic history operates more like a pinball machine, ideas endlessly bouncing off each other backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. So it may be helpful from the outset that I clarify what this talk is not. This survey will focus upon mechanically reproducible typefaces and not lettering. To include the latter would simply be not possible in the limited time allocation. But it will touch upon some of the writings around typefaces as well as the design work itself. This survey will not include every single person who has ever designed a typeface in Australia. Such an exhaustive, or should I say exhausting, list can be found courtesy of the all-seeing, all-cataloguing Luc de Vroys. Okay. That man is incredible, absolutely incredible. He's more machine than man. When I was reading about him, and he does computer science, and it makes perfect sense. Anyway, because this is... What's the... Oh, dear, that's it. Was I trying to channel Luke or something there? Anyway. Instead, I've chosen to explore the curious tension between typefaces designed by Australians and Australian typefaces. This may appear like I'm splitting hairs, but acknowledging this distinction is central to this paper. Typefaces designed by Australians are indeed that. But for those resultant typefaces to somehow seek to reflect a national identity is a whole other thing. In 1996, I wrote what I thought at the time was just a throwaway line. Whenever I read text set in Gill Sands, I can't help but hear the voice of an English narrator reading along with me. Then the next page, Australian graphic designers have a lot to say, we just haven't got a font to say it in. Now, part of this was a response to going to Typo Berlin 95. It was the Fuse conference, and Tobias, I think you were speaking at it, I'm pretty sure. And what I noticed that so much of the work looked so similar that the only thing that seemed to make each speaker slightly individual was the name of the bin in the corner of the screen. Sometimes it would say, wastebasket or papierkorb and so forth. It was quite strange. So I was quite interested in this idea of cultural difference. Anyway, back to the quote. In the 28 years since, this much quoted statement is something that I've come back to. These are the thoughts of a young designer in search of an identity. A young Australian designer tired of having his International Design Conference lanyard forever misinterpreted as Austrian. The second most common question I get asked is there an Australian typeface? It's the kind of question, it's the best kind of question there is, because there is no answer. It's like a form of utopia, an ideal, a quest rather than an actual destination. Without becoming too zen about it all, it's the process of questioning and searching for the identity that is the important part. And you'll see aspects of this journey in many of the typefaces that I show in this presentation tonight. For young Australian designers, the impossible quest for the Australian typeface is a rite of passage, a necessary step in understanding not only the relationship between typefaces and ourselves, but is also an important lesson in recognising that most invisible of cultural ingredients, time. Being a keen gardener, I can't help but draw some sort of a metaphor here. When you're planning a new garden, when you're planting a new garden, the one thing you cannot buy is time. Plants are given the space they need to eventually grow and occupy. This evolution just takes the time that it takes. Nationally identifiable typefaces operate in a similar manner. Roger Escoffon's Antique Olive, or Eric Gill Sands, or Meindinger's Helvetica have all acquired the unique ability to be read as cultural shorthand only through their repeated use in a very specific place over a very long time. Prior to the starting point of this brief survey, 1983, there was very little written about Australian graphic design culture, let alone Australian typography. Although not specifically centred upon typography, Mimo Cozzolino's Symbols of Australia, first published in 1980, so it slightly sits outside of this scope, although it was republished many times, was a significant and meticulously researched showcase of colonial-era branding, highlighting the xenophobically racist voice of early Australia. And, as is often the case, it took the clear-eyed perspective of a migrant to cast light upon the culture of his adopted home. It was in that same year, 1983, that Geoffrey Caban wrote A Fine Line, an excellent general history of Australian commercial art, a term that was in itself entering its twilight. Importantly, A Fine Line did actually document the adoption of international modernism into the 1960s, upon what would have been a very parochial design profession. It does make mention of some of the earlier Australian designers who had a particular interest in typography, such as Alastair Morrison, but only within a broader graphic design context. Okay. Unsurprisingly, Australian typeface design has been sculpted by technological developments and the bigger international undercurrents, patterns, and trends. Influences within the wider graphic design culture, such as deconstruction, an interest in the vernacular and the anti-mastery, designer as author, they can all be mapped upon the continuum of design work coming out of Australia. Like elsewhere across the globe in the mid to late 1980s, Australian typography responded to the paradigm-shifting technology of desktop publishing. Many typefaces created in Australia for earlier technologies, such as photo typesetting, were redrawn and re-released into digital form. The typefaces from Russell Bean's Type Associates were an instance of this transition from analogue to digital. Perhaps most importantly within the context of this survey, many of his typefaces suggested aspects of Australian life. There's Billabong, Bougainville, Fremantle, Macquarie. For Australians, these are all familiar words, familiar names, colonial though they are. Recent echoes of this can also be seen in Troy Leinster's naming of his recent typeface, Brisbane. But more on that later, Troy. Okay. The economic turbulence of the 1980s led to several short-lived typefaces called ghost faces. Nevertheless, they are a part of the overall narrative. Ansett Caslon, designed in 1989, designed by Brian Sadgrove, was part of a larger branding campaign by Campaign Palace when Reg Ansett sold the airline to Sir Peter Abels and Rupert Murdoch. The airline had been initially just called Ansett, up there. The full point lending the single name some visual authority and decisiveness. The word Australia was later added to address an international audience. As Sadgrove explained, Caslon was chosen because it has a simple authority about it. The 2T ligatures could be ligatured well, and the whole look wasn't too designery. Pretty much everything ends up kerned and with the full point after it, which in hindsight seems a little bit 90s excessive. And there is a lot of full stops here. The true type version of Ansett Caslon, there we go, which was designed to run on Mac OS 6, no less, features one of the classic hallmarks of a customised typeface, a set of specific brand ligatures. Option Shift A would deliver a perfectly kerned ants, Option Shift D, the et, Option Shift S, the os, Option Shift E, the tra, and Option Shift T, the lia, all conveniently located on the keyboard to spell out the word Ansett Australia. Reflecting on this project, Sadgrove is philosophical about the ultimate demise of the airline only several years later. He said the original design was all changed before the airline died, so be it. Another typeface that is lost from the 1980s is this one. Designed by Alex Stitt and Bruce Weatherhead and drawn by Ian Hawkesby, this is a typeface called Track. And remember, this is from the 80s, as if you couldn't tell. It's part of an identity system to promote the new arcade and cinema complex in Toorak in Melbourne. The abbreviation of Toorak to track by the local ladies inspired the meaning, inspired the name. Now get this, prints of the typeface were even handed out to the arcade retailers for their own usage as pieces of paper, typefaces, just handing out. Extraordinary. I mean, I think they should bring that back. That'd be fantastic. I could just imagine these little ladies from Toorak trying to, yoo-hoo stick a headline together. Influenced by the revival of typographic modernity, it channels Bayer's Universal, Lou Bellin's Avant-Garde, and Taylor's Blippo Black. As Stitt admits himself, modernism was in. The track arcade and cinema eventually fell on hard times, closing in the early 2000s, and along with it, any trace of the typeface. This was only found when I went into the Alex Stitt archive. So there are many typefaces still there waiting and waiting. But more successful and enduring projects do exist. In 1988, Emery Vincent and Associates were commissioned to design a bespoke titling typeface for Australia's new Parliament House. Playfully known by the local design press as Capitalist Senatus, the typeface answered the pragmatic demands of the project, while subtly referencing some of the early signage of the Australian colonial era. The result is a curious amalgam of Trajan, avant-garde, Futura, and copperplate Gothic. That's enough to give anybody indigestion, I would say. Having been installed nearly 40 years ago, the success of Emery's typeface lies not only in its skillful execution and its avoidance of a laboured Australianness, but its enduring presence within the Australian institution, meaning that it is still there, it is still used. And that's an important point because I'm talking about time here tonight. Emery observed, as part of our research, we combined information showing examples throughout the history of Australian type and analysed what we found, looking for any trends that we could identify as somehow being Australian. Really, although we would have loved to have discerned some evidence of a developing vernacular, there was nothing we could identify that was particularly distinctive. So that's a big no. By the beginning of the 1990s, there were local attempts at addressing the ubiquity of desktop publishing. QWERTY contributed to a larger international interest in cultural vernaculars. In 1992, the second issue of the QWERTY series, The Vernacular Issue, explored the existence of a truly Australian typographic expression. Despite its well-intended premise, this is my own work, my early career reliance on aesthetics, which I guess is the fault of any young designer, ultimately led to a rather contrived and reductive effort to try to find a national typographic persona. This interest, of course, had been fueled by texts such as Lift and Separate, produced by the Llewellyn Study Centre, the Photographic Observations of Ed Feller, and the typeface that encapsulated that era, Barry Deck's Template Gothic, whose echoes can be seen in QWERTY 4, the recession issue, because Australia was going through the recession. That's it there. Which created a typeface called Bankrupt, which was a typeface based on the glue outlines of storefront signage left after going out of business. So that's it there. I even drew some small caps as well. It is actually I mean, to be honest, it is loosely based on Dwiggins's Caledonia or something like that anyway, but it's, you know, it's there. I think the idea is more important than the execution, obviously. The vernacular era was running in parallel with the undercurrents of deconstruction and the self-taught intuition of figures such as David Carson. This wholly imported trend saw the development of smaller, independent digital foundries. Ta-da. One of these was Prototype, whose 1996 type catalogue, that one there, presented an assortment of typefaces that clearly took advantage of the then recently released font editing software Fontographer. I was actually going to show a picture of what Fontographer looks like in its box and everything, but just to bring back old memories. In this sense, Prototype formed an Australian parallel to other foundries such as Andrew Bailius's Garcia fonts in Spain, or even Carlos Segura's T26 or Garage fonts. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with them. I'm sure they're etched and bruised deep into your mind. By printing their character sets in a catalogue, these typefaces, few of which, in fact none of which I don't think would work on current operating systems, have now become more easily recorded within surveys such as this. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. Okay, so for type historians and scholars, it's super important that you print your typefaces. Very important. I say this because Australian printed type samplers have been relatively rare over the past 40 years, making the tracing of any typographic evolution quite challenging. Those few that do exist include the Recollection typeface produced by Dominic Hofstede and Vincent Chan, and as well the the Oblique series by Letterbox. As design writer Rick Poyner observed in the Australian issue of I in 2002, he came out here for a good 3 or 4 months. He wrote, "It's odd, looking at contemporary Australian graphic design, how little it seems to be informed by a strong sense of place. If it is rare in the wider practice of graphic design with its more extensive toolkit of visual expression, then trying to achieve this link in a typeface is even trickier. But the search for national identity is a perilous journey. Any attempt to visually represent national culture can lead to a brutal abbreviation, compressing the complexity of lived experience of a place into a pattern of crudely related symbols." The Canberra Centenary Typeface competition in 2013 brutally highlighted the problem of developing a place-themed typeface. Admittedly, this competition was actually open to all Australian residents. So the vast majority of the results were ... well-intended. I was a judge. I saw them, believe me. I still have nightmares. They were well-intended but not very professionally produced. The winner, James Rafidopoulos, dealt with the brief in a more nuanced manner with a more subtle nod to the era of Canberra's formation a century before. But it is not just our national capital that has been the conceptual basis of a typeface. In 2012, the Australian type designer Troy Leinster developed the typeface Brisbane as a project for his type media course in the Netherlands. Reflecting upon its design, he noted, "The characteristics which I believe give Brisbane," that's the place, not the typeface, Its distinct flavour are optimism, ingenuity, cleanliness, its eponymous river, outdoor lifestyle, and indeed some outlaw lifestyle, I'm sure, as well as the people of Brisbane who are relaxed, unpretentious, and self-assured. Now, if you think that that's ambitious to conceptually express all of that in one typeface, you can imagine how challenging it would be to extrapolate that to an entire nation. Okay, you're getting where I'm going here now. So far, I've been framing this as a history of individuals, but of course, there have been Australian type communities. With such a small population spread across a massive, massive continent, trying to sustain any group of like-minded people is always challenging. So formalised type communities are a rarity. From the mid-1980s to 1991, the Australian Type Directors Club was established for the small community of typographers, mainly working within advertising agencies. Since 2009, the Australian chapter of the International Society of Typographic Designers, or the ISTD, has been running student assessments at design schools, while typism has been joyfully bringing together the lettering community for over a decade. Congratulations. And most recently, a small consortium of Australian and New Zealand type designers known as counterforms have got together to address issues of inequality and social justice. And I would encourage you all to go to their website and have a look at various fonts that they're working on. This is quite pertinent, this idea of inequality and social justice, because as this survey highlights, there is clearly a gender bias within the world of Australian type design, with women being far more present within the field of lettering. This follows similar conventional contours in other parts of the world. Now, for our international audience, I thought it's important that I point out a particularly Australian phenomena, first described in 1950 by a man called Arthur Phillips. It's only now showing signs of fading. The Australian cultural cringe. I mention it because I would argue that this internalised inferiority complex born of colonialism has played a role in the evolution of Australian typography. Despite the few exceptions already shown, right up to the 1990s, Australian institutions requiring custom typefaces would habitually commission those from the Northern Hemisphere. The commissioning of Harmony by Jeremy Tankard for our main telecommunications carrier, Telstra, in 1999 is a case in point. I thought I'd put that one in there for the oldies. Yes, but it is actually there for a reason. By the early 2000s, many Australian designers were returning to their homeland, having graduated from the multitude of type design courses run overseas, most notably the Type Media course at KABK in Holland and the master's program at the University of Reading, or from periods of working at established international foundries. These returning emigres include Michael Bukowski, Vincent Chan, Wendy Ellerton, David Foster, Troy Leinster, Dan Milne, and Wayne Thompson, amongst many, many others. I would also specifically mention Wei Huang, whose open source work Sans, available through Google Fonts, is arguably the most widely used Australian typeface I can think of. Unless there's somebody else who wants to take me up on that afterwards. The old adage, you can't be what you can't see, also plays a role here. Because by the 2000s, Australian type designers could look across the ditch to our Kiwi neighbour, Chris Sowersby, whose foundry, Klim, offered a model of a rigorous practice that could be viably run from the Antipodes. So thank you, Chris. What this meant, basically, we no longer had to move to be taken seriously. I would argue that this is perhaps one of the most significant shifts in the trajectory of Australian type design, leading to a steep professionalisation in Australian type design, bringing a new technical confidence to the field, all supported by seamless international connectivity. The commissioning of a custom typeface for our national broadcaster, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, or ABC for the acronym, in 2015 is a particularly interesting recent project as it broaches this complex issue of national identity. The designer of ABC Sans, Wayne Thompson, reflects, "It occurred to me that there is one factor that unifies all Australians, a sense of open space." Or what author Tim Winton refers to as our impossibly open sky dwarfing everything. And that is very true. As soon as you hop off a plane in Australia, you are almost blinded by the clarity of light and the open sky. And although initial designs reflecting that wide brown land were rejected, Thompson looked to other cues. "I tried to represent the national identity in ways that also improved legibility. As such, ABC Sans includes very open apertures. These avoid the letters closing up at small sizes, but also subtly communicate a welcoming, inclusive, easygoing nature." So it's not just people from Brisbane. The original font family of 11 weights, I'll go back to that, sorry. There we go. The original font family of 11 weights, designed by Australian Type Foundry, were produced in 2016 with italics and condensed weights being added in 2020 to make the family more versatile. And you can see it if you just turn on the ABC, it'll be there. Another current practitioner whose typographic output represents this period of cultural confidence is Vincent Chan, aka Matter of Sorts. The case studies shown here include custom typefaces AP Pro, AP for Australia Post, and Preston, as in Margaret Preston, I presume, for the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Despite Chan's rigorous historical awareness, and this is evidenced by his research, with few exceptions such as TN Monuments, which I think is there, TN Monuments and the recent Powerhouse series of typefaces, the need to express a specific cultural sense of place is not an explicit element in the final design. But this is not to be read as a deficiency. In fact, it can be seen as a confidence in the pragmatics of the typeface doing the job at hand. I mean, do we need to be constantly reminded what country we're in when we're posting off a parcel? Probably not. I was reminded of this the other day when I was reading Jost Huschuli's retrospective, typobiography, in which he reflected, "I attach no importance to any sort of personal style. I believe that if my work as a typographer is honestly executed, focused on the content, with the means at my disposal, and with regard to the future reader, it will inevitably result in a personal style." Which I think it does. You can tell Hoshuli's work at a glance. If we replace the word personal with national, you get the idea. The confident output of the current generation of Australian type designers signifies what I would call a post-national era in Australian type design. Sure, it is international in its scope, but not the imported steamroller internationalism of mid-20th century modernism, flattening everything into neat grids of Helvetica. Its proficiency does speak outward to an international audience, but with a more nuanced form, avoiding the crude abbreviations of Australian culture down to some sort of typographic shorthand. But whether any of these recently produced typefaces ever go on to become suggestive of an Australian culture will be beyond our own control and, I suspect, even beyond our own lifetimes. Within the context of Australian typography, this curious tension between the rational and the national is a fascinating one. On one hand, it can be argued that with the ever-increasing pace of creative output and redundancy, that the age of enduring typefaces that eventually go on to reflect a national culture, think of Gill Sans, Mistral, etc., etc., those days are over. Expanding on just those two examples, both England and France are more culturally complex, more multicultural than in the days of Roger Escoffon or Eric Gill. Things have fundamentally changed. Metaphorically, this reminded me of something. It reminded me of an image claimed to be... Oh, that's interesting. No, it didn't remind me of that, but... Can we get rid of that little box in the corner? Oh, it's gone, thanks, yep, excellent. Okay, metaphorically it reminded me of something. It reminded me of an image claimed to be the very first photograph ever made, or well, it's actually not a photograph, it's a daguerreotype, as they call them. Now, given the very, very long exposure of the image, and this is taken in Paris during a very, very busy day in Paris, given the very long exposure of the image, the moving crowds of the Paris streets have completely and utterly disappeared. The only thing that can be seen, the only identifiable human being in this entire image is this man here. And this man is standing still because he's having his shoes shined. Only the most still element becomes legible. The idea that a national culture can stay still for long enough to be rendered typographically may have become an antiquity, a memory of a bygone era. Perhaps the ever-evolving nature of a national identity being expressed through a single typeface is now more of an impossibility than ever before. On the other hand, the rising impact of artificial intelligence within the field of type design makes it more important than ever before that type designers pour a little bit of themselves, a little bit of their humanity, and a little bit of their culture into their work. Not only will this be an important point of difference, it may even become a survival strategy. I am sure this is a very pertinent concern for all of those within this room and will be discussed in and between sessions of this conference. All of this brings us up to the now. In 2024, Australian typography is in a very happy place. Australia is now more aware and embracing of our geographical location within Southeast Asia, with its rich spectrum of languages and cultures. There has never been more interest in the field, leading to clients understanding the importance of having a distinctive typographic voice. And importantly, we now have the practitioners to craft them. And yet, some historical consistencies remain. The first recorded Australian typeface, at least the first one that I've ever found, from the 1870s, was a set of crude glyphs forged in iron for branding cattle. And 150 years later, the key motivation behind contemporary Australian type design is also for branding, albeit in a less visceral form. So what has this 40-year survey of Australian typography uncovered? If there is one consistent theme, it would be the ever-present concern about national identity. Being a colonial settler nation, this quest offers both light and darkness. This exploration of a national typographic identity has come in a number of different appearances. In its observational form, such as with QWERTY, in its metaphoric form, such as Brisbane and Canberra, and in its more subtle pragmatic form, where its absence is oddly conspicuous, such as AP Pro, etc. Whether the work of the professional type designer can truly express the cultural life of Australians is yet to be seen. The hope, however, is still alive. Perhaps I'll leave the last word to Gary Emery, who said, when working on the Parliament typeface in 1988, "If we look inwards, then we can create a sense of place and a sense of meaning that is Australian. The visual manifestation of that will be unique." Thank you.
You get to meet at last.
Thank you.
We will definitely throw to the floor, but I just wanted to just tie a bow on that because it's the end of the sort of the tech talk portion of the conference, and what we thought was that this sort of review or this survey of the Australian landscape of type design would be a really good way to sort of transition from today to tomorrow's talks. And I love that you mentioned the branding idea, because we've actually got the branding and blockchains kind of talk to start off first thing tomorrow. So I don't know if we curated it that beautifully, but it really has worked out very nicely that Clint and friends will be talking about that exact topic as the first talk to kick off tomorrow. And it's just been such a rewarding thing for me to see you talking about these things. And I'm sure you've gone through the guest list and curated your talk specifically. But I mean, you've literally mentioned the kind of the cream of Australian type designers, and I'm literally eyeballing several of them at the moment. So I just think that's a really lovely moment to kind of end today and really kind of acknowledge just how far we've come in those 40 years, but also the beauty of having everybody together in this one room tonight. So I just want to say thank you for that. That was fantastic. Awesome. All right, so I might get Eric to run around with some microphones maybe. If we've got some questions in the audience, just stick your hand up for Stephen and I'm sure he'll answer them. Any questions? I think Wayne should ask a question. He's just excited to see his sketchbooks up there. It's awesome. There we go. All right, I'll hand you back.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. And would you please give me some information where I can visit some museum about typography here, maybe in Brisbane?
Museum of Typography.
Museum. Any museum of typography?
In Brisbane, I don't think there is such a thing.
I think unfortunately that the idea that this is such a sort of a new art form is the museum is here. It's a living museum today.
Okay.
Gosh.
We literally have all
That's
the
great.
type
So
designers
the
Australia.
museum is just around me.
You are in a living
Museum.
Australian
Living.
Oh, I'm so proud of.
museum, right?
Thank you so much.
No, but I should also point out though that there are
Yeah.
archives. I teach at RMIT University in Melbourne, and we have a huge design archives area. It's like 3 or 4 floors of underground bunker stuff, and it's full of this kind of stuff. That's how I found quite a lot of Alex Stitt's work, is through that archive. So they do exist. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not quite on the kind of Herb-Lebellin Study Centre, end of things, but it's, step by step we're getting there.
Yes, I know. I'm so lucky that I sit just next to a living museum.
I wonder how he feels about that.
Wow, a living museum. I didn't realise I looked quite that old. Doing my best. Stephen, I did think of a question. Fantastic presentation, by the way. That was absolutely excellent.
Thank you.
It was more so a point that I wanted to make about the cultural cringe, and this is an idea that's fascinated me for quite a long time as well. And you made the point that your feeling is that this cultural cringe is diminishing as we mature as a culture and a nation. In my personal experience, I still see it alive and well all of the time, in the sense like that sort of corner of the cultural cringe, that this idea that if something comes from overseas, it must be somehow better or superior in quality than the equivalent that's produced here within Australia. And I see it all the time in the sense that I still hear of custom typefaces being commissioned by Australian ad agencies where they still go to overseas. Particularly English, I find a lot, type foundries. That's the only point that I wanted to make.
But I would also argue that conversely, Australian type designers can, and particularly Chris and so forth in New Zealand, and they can work on international projects. So I guess what I'm saying is that it can work both ways. And going back to one of the main kind of what I call it sub-themes of this talk, which is about time. I think the element of time plays a role in what you're talking about, which is that it's going to take a very long time for that to... But even just the fact that ATypI is being held in Brisbane, I mean, that's a living example. You would never have had that 10, 20 years ago.
Okay, we have...
It's not a question, it's more of an answer to about the Museum of Typography. I have opened the State Library of Queensland website, and they have an Australian Library of Art showcase, and their current display is A is for Ox. The Australian Library of Art showcase displays rare items curated from State Library collections, and the current display, A is for Ox, focuses on the art and history of typography. Yeah, have you seen it? Yes, yeah. So there you go. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the information.
Oh, there's somebody over there.
And personally, I have a question for another perspective, that if you have any information about, in the 4 decades, about the typography maybe applied on the indigenous people of Australia.
Yeah, that is an unfortunate sort of absence, in the sense that they are sort of orally communicated cultures. So to my knowledge, and I've never, ever read anything about anything being typographic from that Indigenous perspective. No. This very much starts with the voice of the coloniser. Yeah. there. That's Australian history. That's the way it is. I mean, you know, people always say that there's like 3 distinct stages of Australian history. You know, there's pre-colonial history, colonial history, and then multicultural history. So, I mean, I see that this covers 2 of those 3.
Yeah, I think there's a hand up over there.
Mm.
Yeah. Mark at the back.
Stephen, thank you very much for that. You mentioned that it might be impossible for Australia to discover its identity in a single typeface, but my question to you is it possible to reveal that identity with a genre? For example, like black letter. It's not a single typeface, but it's a genre that we usually associate with Germany. So is it possible, is it a challenge even for type designers from here to maybe create a genre over time?
I think typography is very good at communicating unified, collectively agreed concepts, and that's why it's great for brands, because a brand unifies all of the aspirations of the company, you know, and everybody in that company wants to go along for the ride. So there's a unified single message. I think typography does that really well. I think typography can also communicate other kind of more simplified narratives very, very well. My argument here is that national identity is just way, way, way too complex and way, way too big for a blunt instrument such as a typeface, and I'm not being obviously, you know, I'm trying to be offensive there, but that is a very blunt a tool to use for such a complex form.
I do a bit of publishing in the First Nations art space, and I constantly scream when I see another catalogue set in Helvetica or Futura, and I find that completely irrelevant or inappropriate for the subject matter. And I think, like you were just saying, in the absence of our First Nations people not having a written language, we've even imposed phonetic spelling of their language, and we still set their language in Western typefaces. I just wondered whether there's an opportunity for even a genre to be created that is distinctive even for that part of Australia.
Well, I mean, there have been international attempts, like particularly to add millions of extra glyphs into the Unicode, you know, to extend Unicode into all different languages. That would be about the only way of actually going into every single one of those language communities and seeing if there are distinctive sounds that need to have a distinctive glyph related to that sound. That's about the only way I can see that working.
Yeah, I was only thinking stylistically rather than...
right,
like
okay,
the
yeah.
alphabet,
Yeah.
Hi, so I have a colleague, Mark Gowing, who also works in the arts sector with Indigenous mobs, and I think one of the most important things is that the style isn't, any style used that's adapted isn't condescending. From what he's told me, like, I don't want to speak for him, he's not here, but from things he's told me, Indigenous mob see written language as a white man's thing, and they're happy to leave it at that, because they don't, yeah, that's yeah. And I mean, I draw fonts, and I've noticed that there's a bit of lack of support for Unicode that is needed for Indigenous languages in Australia, like D, L, N, and R with an underscore under it. It's just interesting because it's adapted from a grassroots perspective where they didn't have the characters to write their language with, so they'll just use like the underline function to kind of make a pseudo character. But I'm hoping that more Australian designers start to add those letters pre-composed into their typefaces. I just wanted to add that in as a side note.
Just as an adjunct to what you're saying, this morning, at about midday or whatever, I was going through QAG and I was looking at their permanent collection in QAG, and I came across a painting by Richard Bell, and it actually says Australian art does not exist. They're like, it's huge type up there. Australian art does not exist. Now, Richard Bell is an Indigenous artist, and the actual caption to the painting said that was he was trying to get this point across. Each word is written in a different typeface, and this here I'm quoting the little didactic. Jesus, I'm in a type world here. I don't know what I'm saying. Each word is written in a different typeface, suggesting the many artistic directions seen in contemporary Australian art. So he was trying to say that there is no such thing as Australian art, and he was actually trying to express that using typography as well. So that was kind of a curious thing. It was almost a funny little kind of illustration of what I'm talking about today. So, yeah, it's yeah.
I think sort of following on the question of like, will something emerge in an identity? Do you think it's too soon? If your survey was over 40 years, but when was Johnston designed? Or those things that have emerged in other areas, maybe it's just not here yet. But I look at the typefaces that you mentioned, like Brisbane, but Gordita. From ATypI, designed right here as well. And there is like an openness and friendliness, and along with that, and Work Sans and some of the others that you mentioned. And I wonder if some of the characteristics might be there, but maybe there's not enough of a body of work. I wonder if you think it just needs more time.
Time. I completely agree that time is an ingredient, and time is one of those ingredients that we seem to forget about. Now, I think the awareness of time is greater within the typographic community than it is in the graphic design community, where it's very much based around novelty and the nowness of it all. But I do think that we do need to acknowledge time. There is no doubt about it. Time and the fact that cultures were once a lot more homogenous. They were solid, they were set, they were white. There was a whole agreed set of values, and that made that translation into a typeface so much easier. Whereas now, I'm just the more I study this, the more I realise that it's actually an impossible task. But it's an important task. I'm not having a go at anybody who wants to undertake that quest. That's great, but I just don't think we should expect it.
Hi, I was just wondering. The point is more about the history and less about the present day. I was just curious about that, looking through the Symbols of Australia book and also seeing the artifacts on the sides of buildings and other sort of ephemera. It seems clear that the lettering and part of the typographic tradition hewed pretty close to a British origin. That it was a small step away from that, and I was wondering if you had seen any theme of consciously cutting that tie between here and Britain as part of finding a more specific style or identity.
I wouldn't have said there's a conspicuous break at all. In fact, when I was at the art galleries, I was noticing that all the signage was in gill sands all throughout those buildings. I wouldn't necessarily say that at all. I still think that it's a soup of influences, which is fine, because we are a multicultural society. We're one of the most successful multicultural societies, and that might be our cue. Is that we might over time take on some of the particular perspectives of those communities that that have adopted Australia. But to go to your question, I wouldn't say that there's an actual discernible break from Mother England. Yeah. But it's an interesting point, though. Yeah.
Thank
Hi, Stephen.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. My question kind of relates to the talk about Indigenous aesthetic and colonialism. Do you think with a lot of people sort of questioning the colonial project, the need or the desire for a national identity is sort of irrelevant for a lot of people? And in that sense, can we just make work that's of a time and a place, and then later it gets kind of assembled into some sort of national identity? Like, is that the time aspect that we're talking about, the retrospective assessment?
Yep. I think in some ways, I think that perfectly encapsulates my argument, which is that we only see these things, they only become legible, to use that metaphor again, from a long time. And I do think that it'll be 50, 100, 200 years until some of these typefaces actually do become identifiable or suggestive of the culture that it comes from. So we all have to be terribly patient, ridiculously patient. But I don't think that it's as important to people, to get to your point about being seen as Australian or as seen in English. I think that really begins to kind of create those crude abbreviations that we don't want to do. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this before, and I was thinking pretty much the only place in the world that you could actually really do a completely wonderfully pure typeface that reflects everybody in the community, and that would be North Korea. And I haven't actually seen it yet, but I mean that would be you would need a single, absolute dictatorial, single vision. That's what you want, if you want that. Of course, as we know, there's always been a parallel between fascism and typography, but don't get me started on that.
Just as an outside perspective, I come from the United States. I first came to Australia in 1975. This is my third time here. And I first heard the term cultural cringe then from a Canadian academic scholar who was comparing it to the similar thing in Canada, which had progressed a little farther, and she was finding that Australian writers and well, we weren't talking about design then, but this excitement was happening then, beginning to happen. So it's fascinating to get this perspective. My feeling was always that Australia, starting then, represented a melding of European culture with Asian and Pacific culture, a very progressive and very, very creative society. So I like the idea of rather open typefaces, and I like where it's going.
Yeah, so do I. That's the thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I want this paper to be an optimistic one. We are in a good place, but we just need to be patient if we want any of these typefaces to be somehow reflective of Australian culture, whatever that is. Yeah.
I guess I'll invite Thomas back up to polish off the day, and then we'll hopefully see everybody back at nice and early at 9 o'clock. So don't party too hard. Pace yourself. We've got a few days to go. Just ramp it up towards the end. Don't go hard today.